What I'm about to tell you is the true story of the largest prisoner of war breakout in history, and one of the most shocking war crimes of World War II. This story is about how 76 Allied airmen broke out of an escape-proof prison camp. Using stolen materials and improvised tools, they had spent nearly a year building a tunnel system that would have impressed professional engineers. But what I am about to tell you is not just about this escape, it's about what happened next. It was so horrific that it shook the entire world. So prepare yourself, and let's understand what really happened. March 24th, 1944. Stalag Luft III, Sagan, Lower Silesia. 9:47 p.m. The wooden trapdoor beneath the heating stove in Hut 107 creaked open with practiced silence. Squadron leader Roger Bushell, known throughout the compound as Big X, peered down into the black mouth of Tunnel Harry. 30 feet below, electric bulbs stolen from German workmen cast a dim yellow glow along the wooden railway that stretched into darkness. The air carried the metallic scent of damp sand and the faint odor of mutton fat from extinguished lanterns. Bushell's breath formed small clouds in the frigid March air as he whispered to the man beside him, "Tonight, we show them that the human spirit cannot be caged." What followed in the next 8 hours would become the largest prisoner of war breakout in history, a testament to human ingenuity and determination that would ultimately cost 50 men their lives and expose the depths of Nazi brutality. The Great Escape from Stalag Luft III was not merely an audacious prison break. It was a collision between the civilized rules of war and the murderous ideology of the Third Reich, a confrontation that would reverberate through the halls of justice long after the last shot was fired in World War II. The story begins not with the escape itself, but with the extraordinary prison that was designed to make escape impossible. Stalag Luft III, constructed in 1942 on the Polish-German border near the town of Sagan, represented the pinnacle of German engineering applied to prisoner containment. The Luftwaffe had chosen this location with meticulous care. The camp sat atop sandy, glacio-fluvial soil that made digging deceptively easy, while creating a stark contrast with the gray topsoil above, rendering any excavation immediately visible to watchful guards. Every hut was raised 18 inches off the ground on concrete pillars, eliminating the possibility of concealed tunnel entrances. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and machine guns commanded sweeping views of the compound, while double barbed wire fences, electrified and patrolled by German shepherds, formed an impenetrable perimeter. Yet for all its security measures, Stalag Luft III was considered among the more humane prisoner of war camps in the German system. The Geneva Convention was largely observed here, and the camp boasted amenities that would have been luxurious in many civilian contexts during wartime. A well-stocked library containing over 3,000 books, a sports field where prisoners played football and cricket, and even a POW orchestra that performed regular concerts. The German commandant, Oberst Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindeiner-Wildau, was a career officer of the old Prussian school, who maintained a grudging respect for his Allied captives and insisted on proper treatment according to international law. Into this carefully controlled environment came 600 of the most determined and resourceful Allied airmen the war had produced. These were not ordinary soldiers, but pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and air crew, men who had already demonstrated exceptional courage by volunteering for the most dangerous duty in the war. Shot down over occupied Europe, they had been funneled through the German prisoner system to this remote compound in Lower Silesia, where the Luftwaffe believed their escape attempts could be contained and monitored. The Germans had gravely underestimated their prisoners. Among the 600 men in the North Compound was a collection of escape artists whose ingenuity and determination would have impressed Houdini himself. There was squadron leader Roger Bushell, a South African-born barrister whose legal mind had been sharpened by years of courtroom combat and whose hatred of the Nazi regime burned with personal intensity. He had been captured twice before and had witnessed German atrocities during previous escape attempts. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck, a fighter ace with 29 confirmed kills, brought the tactical thinking of aerial combat to the problems of ground escape. Wing Commander Harry Day, known as Wings, possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of escape techniques gleaned from multiple breakout attempts across various camps. These men and hundreds of others began planning almost immediately upon their arrival at Stalag Luft III. The scale of their ambition was breathtaking. Rather than the typical small-scale escapes that might free 2 or 3 men, they envisioned a mass breakout that would put hundreds of Allied personnel back into the war effort, while forcing the Germans to divert massive resources to recapture them. The psychological impact alone would be worth the enormous risk. Under Buschel's leadership, the prisoners organized themselves into a sophisticated operation that rivaled any military engineering project. They established specialized committees for every aspect of the escape: tunnel construction, forged document production, civilian clothing manufacture, compass creation, and intelligence gathering. The operation was compartmentalized with military precision. Each man knew only what he needed to know, and security protocols were established that would have impressed professional intelligence services. The tunnel project began in earnest during the spring of 1943. The prisoners had studied the camp's construction and identified 3 potential starting points that offered the best combination of concealment and structural support. They designated these tunnels with the code names Tom, Dick, and Harry, simple appellations that could be discussed openly without arousing German suspicion. Each tunnel would be excavated simultaneously, providing redundancy in case one or more were discovered by the guards. Tom originated in the corner kitchen of Hut 123, its entrance concealed beneath a concrete slab that could be lifted and replaced without leaving visible traces. The tunnel descended 7.5 meters below ground level, deep enough to avoid the seismic detectors the Germans had buried around the perimeter, and extended 67 meters toward the forest that bordered the camp's northern fence. The excavation proceeded with painstaking care, each cubic meter of sand carefully extracted and dispersed throughout the compound using an ingenious system of trouser leg bags that allowed prisoners to scatter soil while walking casually around the camp. Dick began in the washroom sump of Hut 122, descending 10 meters below ground and extending 18 meters before the prisoners made the strategic decision to abandon active excavation and convert the tunnel into a storage facility for the massive quantities of materials their operation required. The tunnel became a subterranean warehouse, housing the 4,000 bedboards that would be needed to shore up the excavations, along with civilian clothing, forged documents, and escape equipment. Harry, the tunnel that would ultimately carry 76 men to freedom, represented the pinnacle of prisoner engineering ingenuity. Its entrance lay beneath the heating stove in Hut 107, concealed by a trapdoor so perfectly fitted that it could be sealed in 20 seconds if guards approached unexpectedly. The tunnel descended nearly 30 feet below ground level and extended more than 330 feet toward the forest, a distance calculated to emerge well beyond the guard towers and searchlight coverage. The construction of Harry required innovations that would have challenged professional mining engineers. The sandy soil, while easy to excavate, required constant shoring to prevent collapse. The prisoners systematically dismantled their sleeping quarters, removing 4,000 bedboards, 90 complete bunk bed frames, 635 mattresses, and 1,699 blankets to line the tunnel walls and ceiling. German guards conducting regular inspections somehow failed to notice that the prisoners were sleeping on increasingly sparse bedding as the months progressed. Ventilation presented another critical challenge. Working 30 feet underground in a confined space, the excavation teams faced the constant threat of suffocation from carbon dioxide buildup. The prisoners devised a primitive but effective air conditioning system using fabric bellows operated by hand pumps and ventilation pipes constructed from joined Klim powdered milk tins. Fresh air was pumped from the tunnel entrance to the working face, while stale air was extracted through a parallel system, creating a circulation pattern that kept the atmosphere breathable even during the most intensive digging periods. Transportation of men and materials through the tunnel required the construction of a wooden railway system that would have impressed professional engineers. Using lumber salvaged from various sources throughout the camp, the prisoners built a narrow-gauge track that ran the entire length of Harry, complete with rope-operated trolleys that could carry either men or boxes of excavated sand. The system included 2 underground stations, Piccadilly Circus at the halfway point and Leicester Square near the tunnel's end, where workers could rest and equipment could be transferred. The electrical system represented perhaps the most audacious aspect of the entire operation. Prisoners had observed German electricians working on the camp's power grid and had carefully noted the location of junction boxes and cable runs. Working with tools fashioned from scavenged materials, they tapped into Stalag Luft III's electrical circuit, running stolen wire throughout the tunnel system to provide lighting that replaced the earlier noxious mutton fat lanterns. The installation was so professionally executed that German electrical inspections failed to detect the unauthorized connections. While the tunnels represented the most visible aspect of the escape operation, equally sophisticated efforts were underway to provide the escapers with everything they would need to survive in Nazi-occupied territory. The forged document section, operating under conditions that would have challenged professional counterfeiters, produced German identity cards, travel permits, and work authorizations that were virtually indistinguishable from authentic documents. Using inks extracted from library books, pens fashioned from metal scraps, and paper obtained through various subterfuges, the forgers created documents that would pass all but the most intensive scrutiny. The clothing workshop transformed military uniforms into civilian attire using techniques that demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Royal Air Force blue was dyed black using ink and boot polish to create business suits, while greatcoats were altered into civilian overcoats. Buttons were replaced with wooden substitutes carved by hand, and military insignia were carefully removed and the fabric rewoven to eliminate any trace of their former presence. The workshop even produced civilian shoes by modifying military boots, adding leather soles and heels crafted from wood and rubber salvaged throughout the camp. Compass production fell to Albert Horace Hake, a Royal Australian Air Force warrant officer whose mechanical aptitude had been honed by years of aircraft maintenance. Working with materials that included melted Bakelite plastic records and silver scraped from razor blades, Hake manufactured precision compasses that were accurate enough for navigation across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. With characteristic Australian humor, he inscribed each compass with "Made in Stalag Luft III patent pending," to prevent captured escapers from being mistaken for spies carrying sophisticated equipment. Map production required the most delicate negotiations with German guards and civilian workers. Prisoners gradually accumulated detailed maps of the surrounding region through a combination of bribery, theft, and careful copying of documents glimpsed during work details outside the camp. These maps were then reproduced by hand, with multiple copies created for each escape route to ensure that navigational information would be available, even if some escapers were captured. The intelligence network that supported the escape operation rivaled professional espionage organizations in its scope and effectiveness. Prisoners had identified and cultivated relationships with German guards, who were sympathetic to their cause or could be bribed with cigarettes, chocolate, and other luxury items available through Red Cross parcels. Through these sources, they obtained information about guard schedules, patrol routes, transportation timetables, and security procedures that would be crucial to the escape's success. Language training became a critical component of escape preparation. Prisoners who spoke German, French, or other European languages conducted intensive courses for their fellow escapers, teaching not only vocabulary and grammar, but also regional accents and cultural mannerisms that might help them blend into local populations. The training included detailed instruction in German bureaucratic procedures, travel regulations, and social customs that could mean the difference between successful evasion and immediate capture. As 1943 progressed into 1944, the tunnel operations faced increasing pressure from German security measures. In September 1943, guards discovered Tom just as it reached the forest edge, leading to a massive security crackdown that included extensive searches, increased patrols, and the installation of additional seismic detection equipment. The discovery was a devastating blow to morale, representing months of backbreaking labor that had been lost in an instant. However, the prisoners' compartmentalized security procedures meant that the loss of Tom did not compromise the other tunnel operations, and work on Harry continued with even greater determination. The winter of 1943-1944 brought additional challenges as the sandy soil froze solid, making excavation nearly impossible during the coldest months. The prisoners used this enforced delay to perfect their escape preparations, conducting detailed rehearsals of the breakout procedure and refining their plans for dispersal once they reached the outside world. They established multiple escape routes that would take them to neutral countries, resistance networks, or allied lines, depending on their individual circumstances and capabilities. By March 1944, Harry had reached a length of more than 300 feet, and calculations indicated that it should emerge well within the forest that bordered the camp's northern perimeter. The tunnel's infrastructure was complete, with electrical lighting, ventilation systems, and transportation railways all functioning smoothly. The escape equipment was ready: civilian clothing for 200 men, forged documents for multiple identities, compasses and maps for navigation across occupied Europe, and emergency rations to sustain the escapers during their initial flight. The decision to proceed with the escape was made during the third week of March 1944, when intelligence reports indicated that the camp's security procedures were at their normal level and weather conditions would provide the moonless nights necessary for the operation. Bushell and his planning committee selected the night of March 24-25, when the new moon would provide maximum darkness and the spring weather would be survivable for men traveling on foot across the Polish countryside. The selection of escapers represented one of the most difficult decisions of the entire operation. More than 600 men had contributed to the tunnel's construction and wanted to participate in the breakout, but Harry could accommodate only 200 men in a single night's operation. Priority was given to those with the best chances of reaching Allied lines: men who spoke German or other European languages, had previous escape experience, or possessed specialized knowledge that would be valuable to the war effort. The remaining slots were allocated by lottery, a democratic process that reflected the egalitarian spirit that had characterized the entire operation. March 24th dawned clear and cold, with temperatures well below freezing and a sharp wind that promised to make travel difficult for men dressed in improvised civilian clothing. Throughout the day, the selected escapers made their final preparations, concealing their civilian clothes beneath their military uniforms and reviewing their cover stories one last time. The atmosphere in the compound was electric with anticipation and anxiety. After months of preparation, the moment of truth had finally arrived. As darkness fell, the escapers began gathering in Hut 107, where the entrance to Harry lay concealed beneath the heating stove. The first man down was squadron leader Bushell himself, leading by example as he had throughout the operation. He was followed by the other priority escapers, each man carrying a small pack containing his forged documents, emergency rations, and whatever personal items he could manage within the strict weight limitations imposed by the tunnel's dimensions. The descent into Harry was a journey into another world. 30 feet below the surface, the tunnel existed in perpetual artificial twilight, illuminated by the stolen electric bulbs that cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and human exertion, while the sound of the ventilation system provided a constant mechanical whisper that masked the movements of the escapers. Men moved through the tunnel in single file, crawling on their hands and knees through passages barely large enough to accommodate a human body, their civilian clothes collecting sand and moisture that would mark them as fugitives if they were captured. The wooden railway system functioned exactly as designed, with trolleys carrying escapers through the tunnel's length in a matter of minutes rather than the hours that crawling would have required. At Piccadilly Circus in Leicester Square, men paused to rest and adjust their equipment before continuing toward the tunnel's exit. The atmosphere was tense but controlled. Months of planning and rehearsal had prepared the escapers for every aspect of the operation, and the military discipline that had sustained them through years of captivity now served them in their bid for freedom. At 10:30 p.m., the first escaper reached the end of Harry and began the delicate process of breaking through to the surface. The tunnel's exit had been calculated to emerge well within the forest, providing immediate concealment for the escapers as they made their way toward the railway line that would carry them away from Sagan. However, as the first man pushed through the final layer of soil and emerged into the frigid March night, he made a discovery that would prove catastrophic for the entire operation. Harry had fallen short of its target. Instead of emerging within the protective cover of the forest, the tunnel exit lay in an open clearing directly beneath one of the guard towers, fully exposed to the searchlights that swept the perimeter throughout the night. The miscalculation was a matter of mere yards, but in the context of a clandestine escape operation, it might as well have been miles. The escapers found themselves emerging directly into the most dangerous area of the entire camp perimeter, with no concealment available and German guards positioned less than 50 meters away. Despite this devastating setback, the escape continued. The first escapers, realizing the desperate nature of their situation, made the courageous decision to proceed rather than abort the operation and condemn their fellow prisoners to continued captivity. They emerged from the tunnel one by one, crawling across the open ground toward the forest edge while German searchlights swept overhead. The operation required split-second timing and nerves of steel. Each man had to wait for the searchlight to pass, then sprint across the clearing and dive into the underbrush before the beam returned. For nearly 8 hours, the escape continued with clockwork precision despite the mortal danger. 76 men successfully made it through Harry and into the forest beyond, disappearing into the Polish countryside with their forged documents and improvised civilian clothing. They represented every Allied nation involved in the air war against Germany: British, American, Canadian, Australian, South African, New Zealand, Norwegian, and Polish airmen who had united in their determination to return to the fight against fascism. The escape was discovered at 4:55 a.m. when the 77th man emerged from the tunnel directly into the beam of a German searchlight. The guards' shout of alarm brought the entire camp to immediate alert, with sirens wailing and searchlights blazing as German personnel rushed to secure the perimeter. Within minutes, the tunnel entrance in Hut 107 was surrounded by armed guards, and the remaining escapers still underground were forced to surrender. The Great Escape was over, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The German reaction to the breakout was swift and overwhelming. Within hours of the discovery, every available police unit, military patrol, and civilian authority in the region had been mobilized in the largest manhunt in German history. More than 70,000 personnel were diverted from other duties to search for the escaped prisoners, including regular army units, SS troops, Gestapo agents, local police, railway security, and even civilian volunteers. Roadblocks appeared on every major highway. Railway stations were flooded with security personnel, and identity checks became routine throughout occupied Poland and eastern Germany. The scale of the German response exceeded even the most optimistic projections of the escape planners. The diversion of 70,000 personnel from other duties represented exactly the kind of disruption to the German war effort that Buschel and his colleagues had hoped to achieve. Every soldier searching for escaped prisoners was a soldier not fighting on the eastern or western fronts. Every policeman checking identity documents was not investigating resistance activities, and every railway security guard looking for Allied airmen was not protecting vital transportation infrastructure from sabotage. However, the escapers themselves faced challenges that no amount of planning could have fully anticipated. The March weather was brutally cold, with temperatures dropping well below freezing and snow covering much of the countryside. Men dressed in improvised civilian clothing found themselves inadequately protected against the elements, while their unfamiliarity with local geography made navigation difficult even with the carefully prepared maps and compasses. The massive German security response meant that every form of transportation was under intense scrutiny, forcing the escapers to travel on foot across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The first recaptures began within hours of the escape. Albert Horace Hake, the Australian warrant officer who had manufactured the compasses, was captured near Görlitz after suffering severe frostbite during his 72 hours of freedom. His civilian clothing, dyed from Royal Air Force blue, had provided insufficient protection against the Polish winter, and his condition was so severe that he required immediate medical attention. Other escapers fell victim to routine identity checks, language barriers, or simple misfortune, a wrong turn that led them into a police patrol, a suspicious railway conductor, or a civilian who reported their presence to the authorities. Within 2 weeks of the escape, 73 of the 76 escapers had been recaptured. Only 3 men successfully reached Allied territory: Norwegian pilots Per Bergsland and Jens Müller, who made their way through Sweden to Britain, and Dutch pilot Bram van der Stok, who traveled through occupied Europe to Spain and eventually reached Gibraltar. Their success represented a remarkable achievement given the circumstances, but it also highlighted the enormous challenges faced by the other escapers who had attempted the same journey. The recapture of the escapers should have marked the end of the Great Escape story. Under the Geneva Convention, escaped prisoners of war who were recaptured were to be returned to their camps and subjected to no more than 30 days of solitary confinement as punishment. This was the standard procedure that had been followed throughout the war, and there was no reason to expect that the Stalag Luft III escapers would be treated differently. However, The Great Escape had occurred at a moment when the Nazi regime was facing mounting pressure on all fronts, and Adolf Hitler's reaction to the breakout would transform a daring prison escape into one of the war's most notorious atrocities. The news of the escape reached Hitler's headquarters within hours of its discovery, and the Führer's response was immediate and violent. According to witnesses present at the meeting, Hitler flew into one of his characteristic rages, screaming that the escaped prisoners were to be shot immediately upon recapture. The scale of the breakout, coming at a time when German cities were being devastated by Allied bombing and German armies were retreating on multiple fronts, represented an intolerable humiliation that demanded the most severe response. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS and architect of the Holocaust, was present at the meeting and immediately grasped the implications of Hitler's order. The execution of captured prisoners of war would constitute a clear violation of the Geneva Convention and would inevitably provoke Allied retaliation against German prisoners. Himmler attempted to moderate Hitler's rage, suggesting that perhaps a smaller number of executions would serve as an adequate deterrent while avoiding the most severe international consequences. Hermann Göring, as head of the Luftwaffe and technically responsible for the security of Air Force prisoners, also raised objections to Hitler's order. Göring pointed out that the execution of Allied airmen would almost certainly result in reprisals against German pilots captured by the Allies, potentially endangering thousands of Luftwaffe personnel who were already in Allied custody or might be captured in the future. The air war had developed its own informal code of conduct, with both sides generally treating captured airmen according to the Geneva Convention, and Göring was reluctant to destroy this arrangement. However, Hitler's rage was not to be contained by practical considerations or international law. The Führer insisted that the escaped prisoners represented a direct challenge to German authority that could not be tolerated. In his twisted worldview, the execution of the escapers would serve as a deterrent to future escape attempts while demonstrating German resolve to both the Allied powers and the German people. After hours of heated discussion, Hitler modified his original order slightly, decreeing that more than half of the recaptured escapers were to be shot. The task of implementing Hitler's murderous decree fell to Heinrich Himmler and the SS apparatus. Himmler, with characteristic bureaucratic precision, fixed the number of executions at exactly 50, a figure that satisfied Hitler's demand for more than half, while leaving 23 survivors to return to Stalag Luft III and spread word of the fate that awaited future escapers. The selection of victims was left to local SS and Gestapo commanders, who were instructed to choose prisoners based on their perceived importance to the Allied war effort and their potential value as deterrent examples. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the German High Command, received the formal order to implement the executions and raised no objections despite his knowledge that the action violated every principle of international law. When subordinates questioned the legality of shooting prisoners of war, Keitel dismissed their concerns with the chilling words, "These escapees must be shot. We must set an example." Keitel's willingness to implement Hitler's illegal order reflected the complete subordination of the German military to Nazi ideology and the abandonment of the professional ethics that had traditionally governed warfare. The mechanics of the murders were left to regional Gestapo commanders, who developed a standardized procedure that would allow them to claim that the prisoners had been shot while attempting to escape. Recaptured escapers were told that they were being transported back to Stalag Luft III and were loaded into cars driven by Gestapo agents in civilian clothes. The vehicles would stop in isolated locations, ostensibly to allow the prisoners to relieve themselves, and the escapers would then be shot at close range with pistols or submachine guns. The first murders began within days of the recaptures. Albert Horace Hake, the Australian compass maker who had been captured near Görlitz, was executed on March 31, 1944, at Iława, Poland, alongside 6 other escapers. The 27-year-old warrant officer, who had survived years of combat flying and months of imprisonment, was murdered in cold blood by men who claimed to represent a civilized nation. His body was cremated, and his ashes were returned to Stalag Luft III in an urn that bore no indication of the circumstances of his death. The murders continued throughout April and into May 1944 as Gestapo units across occupied Poland and eastern Germany carried out their grisly assignments. Squadron leader Roger Bushell, the mastermind of the Great Escape, was shot near Saarbrücken on March 29 while attempting to reach the French border. Flight Lieutenant Bernard Scheidhauer, a French pilot who had joined the Royal Air Force, was killed alongside Bushell. Their bodies cremated and their ashes returned to the camp in identical urns that revealed nothing of their heroic attempt to return to the war. The pattern was repeated across the region as Gestapo agents systematically murdered 50 of the most courageous and resourceful Allied airmen of the war. Flight Lieutenant Rupert Stevens, a South African pilot, was shot near Breslau. Squadron leader James Catnack, an Australian, was murdered near Görlitz. Wing Commander Harry Day, the veteran escape artist known as Wings, was among the 23 survivors who were returned to Stalag Luft III, but only because local Gestapo commanders had already filled their quota of murders. The cover-up operation was as systematic as the murders themselves. Gestapo headquarters issued detailed instructions on how to falsify reports to make the killings appear legitimate. The initial reports, which had been virtually identical in their claims that prisoners were shot while attempting to escape, were deemed too obviously fabricated and had to be rewritten to appear more realistic. Local commanders were instructed to vary the circumstances of the alleged escape attempts and to ensure that the cremation of bodies eliminated any forensic evidence that might contradict their false reports. The return of the urns to Stalag Luft III created an atmosphere of shock and horror that the German authorities had not anticipated. The surviving prisoners immediately recognized that their comrades had been murdered, and word of the atrocity spread throughout the Allied prisoner of war system. The new camp commandant, who had replaced the previous officer after the escape, allowed the prisoners to construct a memorial to house the ashes of their murdered comrades, perhaps recognizing that the executions had crossed a line that even the most hardened German officers found difficult to defend. The international reaction to the murders was swift and uncompromising. British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden rose in the House of Commons on May 19, 1944, to announce that the British government had received reports of the executions and would ensure that those responsible were brought to exemplary justice after the war. The statement represented more than diplomatic rhetoric. It was a formal commitment to pursue war crimes prosecutions that would continue long after the fighting ended. The murders had achieved exactly the opposite of their intended effect. Rather than deterring future escape attempts, they had created martyrs whose sacrifice inspired even greater resistance to German authority. The story of the Great Escape and the subsequent murders spread throughout the Allied prisoner of war system, reinforcing the determination of captured personnel to continue fighting their captors through every means available. The executions had also provided the Allies with powerful propaganda material that could be used to demonstrate the barbaric nature of the Nazi regime to neutral nations and wavering German allies. Within Germany itself, the murders created significant unease among military officers who recognized that the executions violated every principle of military honor and international law. The Luftwaffe, in particular, was horrified by the killings, as they destroyed the informal understanding that had protected German airmen captured by the Allies. Göring's fears proved prophetic. Allied treatment of German prisoners became noticeably harsher after news of the murders became known, and several German pilots were subjected to rough treatment that might not have occurred under different circumstances. The end of the war in May 1945 brought the possibility of justice for the murdered escapers, but it also presented enormous challenges for investigators seeking to identify and prosecute those responsible. The Gestapo had been disbanded, many of its personnel had fled or been killed, and the documentary evidence of the murders had been scattered or destroyed during the final collapse of the Nazi regime. However, the Royal Air Force Police Special Investigation Branch, led by Wing Commander Wilfred Bowes, was determined to pursue the case regardless of the obstacles. The investigation that followed was one of the most thorough and successful war crimes prosecutions of the post-war period. Working with limited resources and facing the enormous challenges of operating in occupied Germany, the SIB investigators painstakingly reconstructed the chain of command that had led to the murders and identified the individual Gestapo agents who had carried out the killings. Their success was due in large part to the meticulous record-keeping that characterized the German bureaucracy. Even mass murder had been documented with typical German efficiency, providing investigators with a paper trail that led directly to the perpetrators. The investigation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy that had led to the murders. Hitler's original order had been transmitted through Himmler to SS headquarters, then distributed to regional Gestapo commanders throughout occupied Poland and Eastern Germany. Each level of the hierarchy had added its own refinements to the killing process, creating a system that was both efficient and deniable. The investigators identified 72 individuals who had participated in the conspiracy, from high-ranking SS officers who had transmitted the orders to individual Gestapo agents who had pulled the triggers. The first major trial, known as the Stalag Luft III case, began in Hamburg in July 1947. 18 defendants, mostly Gestapo agents, faced charges of murder and conspiracy to commit murder in violation of the laws and customs of war. The prosecution case was built on the defendants' own depositions, many of which had been obtained during the initial investigation when the accused believed that cooperation might lead to lenient treatment. The evidence was overwhelming. The systematic nature of the killings, the identical methods used across different locations, and the falsified reports all pointed to a coordinated conspiracy directed from the highest levels of the Nazi hierarchy. The defense arguments reflected the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi system. Defense attorneys claimed that their clients had not known that the victims were prisoners of war, suggesting instead that they believed they were shooting spies or saboteurs. This argument collapsed when prosecutors demonstrated that the escapers had been wearing military uniforms when captured and had been processed through the standard prisoner of war system. The defense also claimed that the accused had been unaware of Hitler's secret order and had believed they were carrying out legitimate security operations, but this argument was contradicted by the systematic nature of the killings and the coordinated cover-up that followed. The most significant defense argument was the claim of superior orders, that the accused had been compelled to carry out the murders by their superiors and could not be held responsible for actions taken under duress. This argument went to the heart of post-war efforts to establish individual accountability for war crimes, and the court's rejection of the defense set important precedents for future prosecutions. The judges ruled that obeying orders that violated fundamental principles of international law and human decency could not constitute a valid defense, particularly when the orders were clearly illegal and the accused had alternatives to participation. The verdicts reflected the court's determination to hold the perpetrators accountable for their crimes. 13 of the 18 defendants were sentenced to death and subsequently executed, while the others received lengthy prison sentences. Max Wieland, a Kripo official who had participated in the conspiracy, was sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentences sent a clear message that war crimes would not be tolerated, and that claims of superior orders would not excuse participation in atrocities. Additional trials followed as investigators continued to track down the remaining perpetrators. 21 members of the Gestapo who had participated in the murders were eventually executed, while 17 others received prison sentences. The investigation's success rate was remarkable given the challenges involved. Of the 72 individuals identified as participants in the conspiracy, more than half were brought to justice despite the chaos of post-war Germany and the efforts of many war criminals to escape prosecution. The fate of the high-ranking officials who had ordered the murders reflected the broader collapse of the Nazi regime. Adolf Hitler, the ultimate author of the murder order, committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery. Heinrich Himmler, who had implemented Hitler's decree, was captured by British forces but committed suicide on May 23, 1945, before he could be brought to trial. Hermann Göring was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trials, but cheated the hangman by committing suicide in his cell on October 15, 1946, just hours before his scheduled execution. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, who had transmitted the murder order to subordinate commands, faced justice at Nuremberg for his role in this and other war crimes. His defense that he had merely been following orders was rejected by the tribunal, which found that his position as head of the German High Command made him responsible for ensuring that military operations complied with international law. Keitel was executed on October 16, 1946, his death representing a measure of justice for the 50 murdered escapers and countless other victims of Nazi atrocities. The legacy of the Great Escape extended far beyond the immediate consequences of the breakout and subsequent murders. The story became a symbol of human courage and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, inspiring countless individuals who faced their own struggles against oppression and injustice. The escape demonstrated that the human spirit could not be contained by barbed wire and guard towers. that ingenuity and cooperation could overcome even the most sophisticated security measures, and that the pursuit of freedom was worth any sacrifice. The investigation and prosecution of the murders established important precedents for international justice that continue to influence war crimes prosecutions today. The rejection of the superior order's defense, the emphasis on individual accountability, and the determination to pursue justice regardless of the passage of time all became fundamental principles of international criminal law. The Stalag Luft III case demonstrated that war crimes could be successfully prosecuted even in the chaotic aftermath of global conflict, providing a model for future efforts to hold perpetrators accountable for atrocities. The story also highlighted the importance of preserving historical memory and honoring the sacrifice of those who died in the pursuit of freedom. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains the graves of 48 of the 50 murdered escapers at Poznan Old Garrison Cemetery in Poland, ensuring that their sacrifice will not be forgotten. The remaining 2 victims, Niels Jürgen Fuglesang and Dennis Oliver Street, are buried elsewhere, but their names are remembered alongside their comrades as heroes who died in the service of liberty. The Great Escape entered popular culture through the 1963 film starring Steve McQueen and Richard Attenborough, which brought the story to millions of viewers worldwide. While the film took considerable dramatic license with the historical facts, it captured the essential spirit of the escape and introduced new generations to the courage and sacrifice of the Allied airmen who participated in the operation. The movie's enduring popularity has ensured that the story of Stalag Luft III remains alive in public consciousness, serving as a reminder of the price of freedom and the importance of resistance to tyranny. The archaeological investigation of the tunnel sites in 2003 provided physical confirmation of the prisoners' remarkable engineering achievements. Researchers successfully located the refilled entrance shaft of Tunnel Dick and found remnants of the wooden shoring and railway system 10 meters below the surface. The discovery validated the historical accounts of the escape and provided tangible evidence of the ingenuity and determination that characterized the entire operation. The preservation of these archaeological remains ensures that future generations will have physical proof of one of history's most audacious prison breaks. The educational value of the Great Escape story extends beyond its dramatic appeal to encompass important lessons about leadership, teamwork, and moral courage. Roger Bushell's leadership of the escape organization demonstrated how a single individual with vision and determination could inspire hundreds of others to work toward a common goal despite enormous risks. The compartmentalized structure of the operation showed how complex undertakings could be organized to maximize security while maintaining efficiency. The willingness of the escapers to proceed, despite the tunnel's failure to reach the forest, demonstrated the kind of moral courage that defines true heroism. The international character of the escape organization reflected the multinational nature of the Allied war effort and the shared commitment to democratic values that united nations with different languages, cultures, and traditions. British, American, Canadian, Australian, South African, New Zealand, Norwegian, and Polish airmen worked together seamlessly, their cooperation transcending national boundaries in pursuit of their common goal of freedom. This international solidarity provided a model for post-war cooperation and demonstrated that people of different backgrounds could unite effectively against common threats. The technical innovations developed during the tunnel construction had implications that extended beyond the immediate escape operation. The ventilation systems, transportation methods, and construction techniques pioneered by the prisoners influenced subsequent escape attempts at other camps and provided valuable lessons for military engineers. The forged document operation demonstrated sophisticated counterfeiting techniques that were later studied by intelligence services, while the compass manufacturing process showed how precision instruments could be created using improvised materials and tools. The psychological impact of the Great Escape on both Allied and German personnel was profound and lasting. For Allied prisoners throughout the German camp system, the escape provided proof that even the most secure installations could be breached through careful planning and determined execution. The knowledge that their comrades had successfully organized such a massive operation boosted morale and encouraged continued resistance to German authority. The subsequent murders, while tragic, reinforced the prisoners' understanding that they were fighting an enemy that recognized no moral boundaries and would stop at nothing to maintain control. For German personnel, the escape represented a devastating failure of security that exposed the limitations of their supposedly impregnable prison system. The fact that 600 Allied airmen had been able to organize such a sophisticated operation under the noses of their guards called into question the competence of the entire prisoner of war administration. The massive manhunt that followed the escape diverted enormous resources from other military operations and demonstrated the vulnerability of the German rear areas to Allied penetration. The murders of the 50 escapers created a crisis of conscience within the German military that contributed to the growing disillusionment with Nazi leadership among professional officers. Many career military personnel recognized that the executions violated fundamental principles of military honor and international law, creating a precedent that could endanger German prisoners in Allied custody. The willingness of the Nazi leadership to sacrifice military effectiveness and international standing for the sake of ideological revenge demonstrated the extent to which political fanaticism had corrupted German military institutions. The post-war investigation and prosecution of the murders established important precedents for transitional justice that continue to influence efforts to address mass atrocities today. The determination of the Royal Air Force Police Special Investigation Branch to pursue the case despite enormous obstacles demonstrated that war crimes prosecutions could succeed even in the absence of extensive documentary evidence or cooperative witnesses. The investigators' success in identifying and prosecuting the perpetrators showed that individual accountability could be established even within complex bureaucratic hierarchies where responsibility was deliberately diffused. The legal principles established during the Stalag Luft III trials contributed to the development of international criminal law and influenced subsequent war crimes prosecutions. The rejection of the superior orders defense established that individuals could not escape responsibility for atrocities by claiming they were merely following commands from superiors. The emphasis on individual accountability reinforced the principle that every person has a moral and legal obligation to refuse to participate in crimes against humanity, regardless of the consequences of such refusal. The documentation and preservation of evidence from the Great Escape and subsequent murders provided valuable lessons for future historical research and war crimes investigations. The meticulous German record-keeping that enabled investigators to reconstruct the chain of command responsible for the murders demonstrated the importance of preserving documentary evidence even when it might incriminate those who created it. The testimony of survivors and witnesses showed how personal accounts could supplement official records to provide a complete picture of historical events. The commemoration of the Great Escape and the murdered escapers has taken many forms over the decades since the end of World War II. Memorial services, museum exhibitions, and educational programs have ensured that the story continues to reach new audiences and inspire new generations. The annual remembrance ceremonies at Poznan Old Garrison Cemetery bring together veterans, family members, and officials from multiple nations to honor the sacrifice of the 50 murdered airmen and to reaffirm their commitment to the values for which those men died. The story of the Great Escape has also influenced military training and education programs, providing case studies in leadership, planning, and execution under extreme conditions. Military academies and staff colleges continue to study the escape organization as an example of how small units can achieve objectives that seem impossible through careful preparation, innovative thinking, and determined execution. The escape's emphasis on compartmentalized security, redundant planning, and adaptive leadership provides valuable lessons for contemporary military operations. The technological aspects of the tunnel construction have been studied by engineers and archaeologists seeking to understand how such sophisticated underground works could be created using improvised tools and materials. The prisoners' solutions to problems of ventilation, transportation, and structural support demonstrated remarkable ingenuity and provided insights into alternative construction methods that could be applied in resource-constrained environments. The electrical system that provided lighting throughout the tunnel showed how existing infrastructure could be modified to serve new purposes without detection. The psychological dimensions of the escape operation have been analyzed by researchers studying group dynamics, leadership, and motivation under extreme stress. The ability of the escape organization to maintain morale and discipline over many months of dangerous work provided insights into how large groups could be motivated to pursue long-term goals despite immediate risks and hardships. The willingness of individual escapers to proceed with the breakout, despite the tunnel's failure to reach its intended destination, demonstrated the kind of commitment that enables extraordinary achievements. The international cooperation that characterized the escape organization has been studied as a model for multinational military and civilian operations. The seamless integration of personnel from multiple nations with different languages, cultures, and military traditions showed how diversity could become a source of strength rather than weakness when united by common purpose. The escape organization's success in overcoming communication barriers, cultural differences, and national rivalries provided valuable lessons for contemporary international cooperation efforts. The moral dimensions of the Great Escape story continue to resonate with contemporary audiences facing their own struggles against oppression and injustice. The willingness of the escapers to risk their lives for the principle of freedom provides inspiration for individuals and groups confronting authoritarian regimes, criminal organizations, and other forms of tyranny. The story demonstrates that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when motivated by deeply held convictions and supported by effective organization and leadership. The legacy of the murdered 50 extends beyond their individual sacrifice to encompass broader questions about justice, accountability, and the rule of law. Their deaths demonstrated the consequences of allowing ideological extremism to override legal and moral constraints, while the subsequent prosecution of their killers showed that justice could ultimately prevail, even when delayed by years or decades. The precedents established by their case continue to influence contemporary efforts to address war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. As we reflect on the Great Escape more than 80 years after its occurrence, the story remains as relevant and inspiring as ever. In an era when democratic values face new challenges and authoritarian movements seek to undermine international law and human rights, the courage and sacrifice of the Stalag Luft III escapers provide a powerful reminder of the price of freedom and the importance of resistance to tyranny. Their legacy challenges each generation to defend the principles for which they died and to ensure that their sacrifice was not in vain. The tunnel that carried 76 men toward freedom on that cold March night in 1944 has long since collapsed, its wooden supports rotted away and its passages filled with sand. But the spirit that drove those men to risk everything for the chance to return to the fight against fascism lives on in every person who chooses courage over comfort, principle over expediency, and freedom over security. The Great Escape was more than a prison break. It was a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit, and a reminder that no wall is high enough, no wire strong enough, and no guard vigilant enough to contain the yearning for liberty that burns in the human heart. In the end, the 50 murdered escapers achieved a victory that their killers could never have imagined. Their deaths exposed the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime and contributed to the international consensus that would eventually bring their murderers to justice. Their sacrifice inspired countless others to continue the fight against tyranny and helped establish the legal principles that continue to protect human rights today. They may have died as prisoners, but they live on as symbols of freedom, their memory preserved not in the ashes that were returned to Stalag Luft III, but in the enduring human commitment to liberty, justice, and the rule of law. The Great Escape stands as one of history's most powerful demonstrations that the human spirit cannot be imprisoned, that courage and ingenuity can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that the pursuit of freedom is worth any sacrifice. As long as people value liberty and resist oppression, the story of squadron leader Roger Bushell and his 75 fellow escapers will continue to inspire and guide those who face their own struggles against the forces of tyranny and injustice.